Victor Harlan's hand came down hard across the girl's face before she even finished speaking. The sound cracked through the general store like a rifle shot. Every head turned. Every mouth went shut. The girl stumbled sideways into a shelf of dry goods, knocking tins to the floor, and not one person in that store moved to help her. Not the clerk, not the two men by the door, not the woman holding her child near the back wall. Harlan straightened his coat, smoothed his lapel. His voice was calm as a man ordering breakfast. You belong to me until I say otherwise. That was your father's agreement, not yours to break. The girl pressed her fingers to her cheek and said nothing. In Black Hollow, Wyoming, in the year 1887, Victor Harlan's word was the only law that mattered. If you've ever watched someone suffer while the people around them looked away, if you've ever been that person no one helped, then this story is for you. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, because every single week there is a new story here, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's go back to Black Hollow, and to the moment one man made a choice that changed everything. Caleb Mercer had not intended to be a hero that morning. He had not intended to be much of anything. He had driven his wagon into Black Hollow before first light, the way he always did when he needed supplies, early enough to avoid conversation, late enough that the worst drunks had already slept it off. He was a practical man with practical habits, and one of those habits was staying out of other people's trouble. Not because he was cold, because he had learned slowly and at great cost that getting involved in things that weren't your business had a way of costing you things you couldn't get back. He'd paid that price once already, so he loaded his wagon with flour, salt pork, lamp oil, and a new coil of rope. He settled his account with the clerk, a round-shouldered man named Pemberton, who never looked anyone in the eye, and he walked back out into the pale morning air with every intention of climbing up onto that wagon seat and pointing his horses north before the town fully woke up. He almost made it. The wagon was hitched to the post at the far end of the main street, which was the only spot left when he'd arrived. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, as he approached with the last of his supplies balanced under one arm, he noticed something that stopped him mid-stride. Canvas at the back of the wagon was moving, not from wind, not from the horses shifting, from something inside. Caleb set his supplies down slowly. He looked up and down the street. 3 men stood outside the saloon on the opposite end of the block, not looking his way, but standing in that particular way that men stand when they're pretending not to watch something. His jaw tightened. He walked around to the back of the wagon, took hold of the canvas edge, and lifted it. A pair of eyes looked back at him from the shadows. Brown, wide-rimmed red from crying. A young woman, maybe 23 or 24, curled behind his flour sacks with her knees pulled to her chest and her bottom lip split open. The left side of her face was already beginning to color. They stared at each other. She spoke first, barely above a whisper. "Please don't scream." Caleb had not been planning to scream. He was the kind of man who did not make sudden loud noises under any circumstances. But he let the canvas down slowly and stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the wagon's tailgate, thinking about what the sensible thing to do was. The sensible thing was to tell her to get out, to say he was sorry for whatever had happened to her, but this was his wagon, and he wasn't in the business of carrying stowaways. The sensible thing was to walk around to the front, climb up, and drive north without looking back. He lifted the canvas again. "How long have you been in there?" he said. "Since before you came out of the store. You watched me load all that?" "Yes, and you still thought hiding in my wagon was a good idea." Swallowed. Her eyes cut sideways to the men outside the saloon. "They're going to check every wagon that leaves today." Mr. Harlan's orders. Caleb did not let his expression change. He'd heard the name Victor Harlan plenty of times. Everyone in this part of Wyoming had. You heard it the way you heard talk of bad weather coming, something you could acknowledge without wanting to discuss at length. "What did you do?" he said. "I left." "Left what?" "An arrangement." She said the word like it tasted of something rotten. "My father made an agreement with Mr. Harlan before he passed. I only found out what the agreement was 3 days ago." Caleb looked at her bruised face. He looked at the 3 men across the street. He looked down at his boots, which were cracked along the left toe and needed replacing, but that was a problem for another season. You got a name, he said. Clara. Clara Whitmore. Clara. He nodded once like he was filing it away. Those men see you come this way? I don't think so. I ran through the alley behind the livery. You think? Or you know? She hesitated. I think. That was the wrong answer. That meant they might already be watching the wagon. That meant leaving quietly and hoping nobody followed was not something he could rely on. That meant he had already been drawn further into this than he'd planned. Caleb let the canvas drop again and stood with his hands at his sides, staring at nothing in particular. He thought about his ranch 40 miles north. Thought about the winter coming in, the way the wind had already started coming down off the mountains at a slant that meant snow inside of 3 weeks. He thought about how much he valued the quiet, the routine, the particular kind of peace that came from being accountable to no one and nothing except his own land. He thought about the sound that Crack had made in the general store. He'd been inside when it happened. He'd heard it without understanding it, and then he'd heard the silence after that thick, cowardly silence. And he had deliberately not turned around, because he was a man who understood the value of not turning around. He turned around now, figuratively. He picked up his supplies, loaded them into the wagon bed alongside the woman he did not know, and without a word to her, walked around to the front and climbed up onto the seat. She lifted the canvas from inside, just her face, low between the flour sacks. What are you doing? She whispered. Leaving town, he said, which is what I was going to do anyway. They'll stop you. Maybe. What do I say if they ask? He picked up the reins and looked straight ahead at the road. His voice was flat and quiet, not unkind. Don't say anything. That's what wives do when their husbands are talking to other men. They let the men talk. There was a pause from behind the canvas. You'd do that? Pretend? He clicked his tongue at the horses and the wagon began to move. I'd do it better if you stayed quiet, he said. The 3 men by the saloon moved when they saw the wagon rolling. Caleb had expected that. He kept his pace steady, the kind of unhurried pace that says a man has nowhere particular to be and nothing to hide. One of the men stepped into the road, big, broad-necked, wearing a coat that was too heavy for the weather and a hat that sat too low on his forehead. Hold up, the man said. Caleb pulled the reins, let the horses settle. Did not say anything, because men who have nothing to hide don't rush to explain themselves. You Caleb Mercer? Got a place up north? That's right. Bought supplies this morning? That's right. The man's eyes traveled slowly over the wagon, over the canvas, over the packed supplies visible through the gaps. He had the careful, practiced look of someone who searched things for a living. Not sharp, exactly, but patient. That was its own kind of dangerous. You come in alone? The man said. Same as always. The man walked around to the side of the wagon. Caleb sat still. His hands were loose on the reins, which took some effort, because his instinct was to tighten his grip. The second man came up on the other side. The third stayed back near the post. The first man put his hand on the canvas. Mind if My wife's resting back there. Caleb said it the way you'd say it to someone who'd just asked to walk into your house without knocking. Tired, mildly annoyed, not defensive. The man's hand paused. Your wife, she doesn't travel well. Gets sick on the road. She was already feeling poorly when we came in this morning, which is why she stayed in the wagon while I loaded. The second man exchanged a look with the first. The first man looked at the canvas. The canvas did not move, which meant Clara was either very still or had stopped breathing entirely. Harlan's looking for a woman, the first man said. Young, brown hair, that right. Caleb's voice carried exactly 0 interest in this information. You seen anyone like that this morning? Running, maybe? Or, I don't make a habit of watching who runs where, in other people's towns, Caleb said. I came for supplies. I got my supplies. I'd like to get my wife home before she's sick all over my flour. The first man looked at him for a long moment. Caleb looked back. Not hard, not aggressive. Just the steady, unremarkable look of a man who is telling the truth and has no reason not to. The man stepped back, jerked his chin at the other 2. They let the wagon through. Caleb did not breathe normally again until the last buildings of Black Hollow were behind him, and the road curved north and the pines closed in on either side. He did not let himself feel anything about what had just happened. There would be time for that later. Right now there was road to cover, and whoever else Harlan might have watching the trails out of town. A full quarter-mile passed before the canvas shifted, and Clara pulled herself up to sit behind him, leaning against the the flour sacks with her legs stretched out and her hands folded in her lap. "Thank you," she said. He didn't answer. "I mean it. You didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The wagon swayed over a rut. Crow crossed the road ahead of them and disappeared into the trees. "My face is swelling," she said. "I know, there's a cloth in the box behind the seat. Water in the canteen beside it." She found them. He heard her wince when she pressed the cloth to her cheek. "Harlan hit you himself," he said. He hadn't planned to ask. "Came out anyway. In the store, in front of 6 people. And nobody. He understood that, in a way he didn't want to examine too carefully. He'd been one of those 6 people. Near enough. He'd heard it, and he'd kept his eyes on the shelf in front of him. "What exactly did your father agree to?" he said. She took a while to answer. "I don't know the full of it yet. I only know that Harlan told me last week that the arrangement was a marriage, that my father had borrowed against the land 3 years ago, and the debt came due when he died, and the debt was me. Land, my mother's land, technically. She died before my father. It borders Harlan's eastern range. There's a river that runs through it, the only year-round water source on that side of the valley. Without it, Harlan can't expand his cattle operation the way he wants to." Caleb thought about that. Thought about what kind of man takes a dead woman's land by marrying her daughter. Thought about the way Harlan had straightened his coat after hitting her, like it was something he'd done before and expected to do again without consequence. "How long was your father in debt to him?" "I don't know. I'm not sure the debt is even real." He glanced back at her over his shoulder. "Meaning?" "Meaning my father was careful with money. He wasn't a borrower. When Harlan showed me the papers, I could see my father's name on them, but..." She stopped. "My father's handwriting had a particular way. He crossed his 7s. He'd done it since he was a boy in Pennsylvania. Every document I ever saw from him had that. The signature on Harlan's papers didn't." The wagon was quiet except for the creak of the wheels and the soft rhythm of the horses. "You're saying the debt is forged," Caleb said. "I'm saying something's wrong with those papers, and no one will look at them. I went to the county clerk. He told me to go home. I went to the circuit judge's deputy. He told me to speak with Mr. Harlan directly." She laughed, short and without humor. "Like I hadn't already tried that. Where are the papers now?" "Harlan has them. And what do you have?" Silence again. Longer this time. "I have a letter," she finally said. "My father wrote it a few months before he died. I don't know if he knew what was coming or if he was just being careful. But he wrote down everything he owned, what it was worth, and who he'd borrowed from, which was nobody. He swore to it and signed it and had it witnessed by a man in Casper." Caleb turned that over in his mind. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't a lot, but it wasn't nothing. "Where's the letter?" he said. "In my boot." He almost smiled at that. Almost. "So you ran," he said. "I ran," she agreed. "I know it wasn't the smart thing. I know I should have stayed and found a lawyer and done it the right way. But Harlan told me last Tuesday that the marriage would happen by the end of the month. That was his version of giving me time." She paused. "I had 11 days left." Caleb said nothing for a long moment. The road ahead was clear. The sky above the pines was that pale, cold blue that comes in the weeks before the first serious snow beautiful, in a way that also feels like a warning. He had 40 miles to go. The horses were fresh, and the road was still passable. He could make the first ridge before dark. "There are people Harlan pays along this road," he said. "Maybe 1 out of every 4 ranches between here and the mountains. He'll have word out by noon. I know. That means don't stop unless we have to. I won't slow you down." He looked at the sky again, felt the temperature in the air. Thought about the mountain pass, and the clouds already stacking up behind the peaks to the north. "I didn't say you would," he said. She settled back against the flour sacks. He could hear her breath evening out. Not calm, not yet, but something approaching it. The relief of someone who has been holding everything together through sheer will, and has finally, for one moment, been allowed to set a small piece of it down. He understood that too. His name was Caleb Mercer. He was 39 years old. He had a ranch in the foothills with 200 acres of decent grazing land, a water well that went deep enough to stay good through dry summers, and a house that had too many rooms. He had not asked for company. He had not asked for trouble. He had not asked for a woman with a bruised face and a letter in her boot and a powerful man's fury coming up the road behind her. But the road north was his road, and she was in his wagon, and Victor Harlan had smoothed his lapel after he'd hit her. So they drove. They made it 4 miles before the first rider appeared behind them. Caleb saw him in the side mirror he'd rigged from a piece of polished tin nailed to the wagon frame. A single horseman coming up from the south at a pace that wasn't casual. Not galloping, not yet, but moving with purpose. The kind of pace that says a man knows where he's going and doesn't want to spook whoever's ahead of him before he gets there. Caleb didn't change his speed, didn't look back, he said quietly. Without turning his head, stay down. The canvas shifted behind him. He heard Clara pull herself flat against the wagon bed. The rider closed the distance over the next half mile. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. The pines on either side were thick here, the trail narrow enough that passing would require one of them to pull off. That was useful. That was something he could work with if he needed to. The rider pulled alongside him. Young, maybe 25, with a thin mustache that hadn't fully committed to being a mustache yet. He wore a Harlan Ranch brand on his coat, a small burned leather patch on the left breast that Caleb had seen on men before. The kind of mark that told you who a man answered to before he opened his mouth. Morning, the rider said. Morning, Caleb said. Cold one. They're all cold ones this time of year. The rider matched the wagon's pace for a moment, looking at the rig, at the supplies, the canvas. His horse was a good animal, dark bay, well-fed, well-shod. Harlan didn't spare expenses on his operation, which was part of what made him dangerous. You come from Black Hollow? The rider said. Just left. You see a woman in town this morning? Traveling alone? Caleb scratched the side of his jaw, slow, like a man actually trying to remember. There was a woman outside the dry goods when I went in. Older, maybe 50, had a basket. The rider shook his head. Younger, brown hair. Can't say I noticed. He paused. My wife's sleeping in the back. She's not well. The rider looked at the canvas. Canvas did not move. Long drive from here to your place, the rider said. It was half statement, half question. The kind of thing men say when they're deciding whether to push further. It is, Caleb agreed pleasantly. Another 10 seconds of riding alongside each other. Then the rider touched his hat brim and pulled his horse off the trail, letting the wagon pass. Caleb did not exhale until the pines closed behind him. He waited another quarter mile before he spoke. He's turning back. Clara came up slowly, bracing herself against the flour sacks. Her face looked worse in the daylight. The bruise had deepened and spread, and her right eye was starting to close up at the corner. He'll report to Harlan, she said. Probably. Won't matter much if we clear the first ridge before they regroup. How far is the ridge? 8 miles, maybe 9. She looked at the sky. The clouds behind the peaks had thickened since morning, pressing lower, the color of old pewter. What's beyond it? Mountains, he said, and then more mountains. And then my place. Is there another way around? A way they wouldn't expect? He thought about it. There was the Kettle Fork Trail, older, rougher, the kind of road that appeared on no county map because it had been cut by trappers 30 years ago and abandoned when the trapping ran out. It added 6 miles to the journey, and the wagon would take a beating on the grade, but it came out above the main pass rather than below it, which meant anyone watching the road from the south would miss them entirely. There's a way, he said. It'll be hard on the wagon. Is it hard on us or just the wagon? Mostly the wagon. Then let's take it. He glanced back at her over his shoulder. She was pressing the damp cloth to her cheek again. Wincing, her jaw set with the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided not to complain about anything. He turned back to the road and said nothing, but he took the left fork when it appeared a mile later. A narrow gap between 2 stands of pine that most people would have ridden right past without noticing. The wagon lurched immediately. Clara grabbed the sideboard. Did not say anything. Caleb respected that. Kettle Fork Trail was worse than he remembered. The summer rains had carved new ruts into the slope, and in 2 places the trail had narrowed to a width that required him to get down and lead the horses by hand, while Clara sat in the wagon seat, holding the reins and keeping the wheels from drifting toward the edge. The drop on the eastern side wasn't fatal, 12 feet into a shallow creek bed, but it was the kind of fall that would snap an axle and leave them both stranded, with no way to carry the supplies and no shelter within 4 miles. They got past both narrow sections without incident, though the second one cost them 20 minutes and left Caleb's boots soaked to the ankle from the creek water that was already freezing at its edges. By noon, they were through the worst of the grade and into the high meadows above the main pass. The wind hit them there, open country, nothing to break it, coming straight down off the northern peaks, with a bite that made the temperature feel 15 degrees colder than it was. Clara had found an old wool blanket under the wagon seat and wrapped it around her shoulders without asking permission, which Caleb noted and found he didn't mind. "You do this drive every year?" she said. She'd moved up to sit beside him on the seat, which was a practical decision, given that the wagon bed was exposed and the wind was worse at ground level. "Twice a year, spring and fall. Alone?" "Always alone." She looked at him sideways. Not prying, just observing. "How long have you had the ranch?" 11 years. "That's a long time to be alone." "I'm not asking for your opinion on it," he said, not unkindly. She turned back to the road. Fair enough. They rode without talking for a while. The mountains around them were the kind of massive that makes a person feel correctly sized. Not small exactly, just appropriately humble. Caleb had spent enough years among them to have stopped feeling anything particular about their scale, but he was aware that Clara was seeing them from the outside, with fresh eyes, and that they probably looked different from there. "My mother loved this kind of country," she said finally. He didn't ask, but she continued anyway. She grew up in Ohio. Flat land, green fields, everything orderly. "When my father brought her out here, she said she spent the first 3 months thinking the mountains were going to fall on her." Clara almost smiled, remembering, but then she said she started to feel like they were the only honest thing she'd ever seen. Said everything else in her life had been arranged to look a certain way. The mountains just were what they were. "Smart woman," Caleb said. She was. The almost smile faded. Harlan never met her. She died before he started buying up the valley. "I think she would have fought him." "What makes you think your father didn't?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "My father was a good man, but he wasn't a fighting man. He believed people meant what they said and said what they meant. When Harlan started showing interest in the land, my father thought it was a business conversation. He didn't understand it was a campaign until it was too late. And the papers, the ones with the wrong signature. My father had been sick for 2 years before he died. Toward the end he was." She stopped, started again. "He couldn't always remember things clearly. I think Harlan used that. I think he got my father to sign something when he didn't fully understand what it was. Or maybe the signature really is forged, and he never signed anything at all. I don't know. I just know the man I grew up with crossed his sevens, and that signature didn't." Caleb thought about what she'd said the previous hour. About the letter in her boot. He thought about a dying man, carefully writing down everything he owned, naming no creditors, signing it in front of a witness. He thought about what kind of man does that, and why. "Your father knew something was wrong," he said. Clara looked at him. "He wrote it when he was sick," you said. "A man who wasn't worried about his affairs doesn't take the trouble to notarize a detailed accounting of his property when he's got more immediate things to worry about." Caleb kept his eyes on the trail ahead. He knew someone was going to come for that land after he was gone. He just didn't know how to stop it. The silence that followed was the kind that means something has been said that needed saying, and the other person needed a moment to decide what to do with it. "I didn't think of it that way," Clara said softly. "Most people don't. They think about what was lost. They don't think about what someone tried to leave behind." She looked at him differently after that. He could feel it without turning to check. The storm announced itself around 2 in the afternoon. Not with snow, but with a shift in the light. The sky went from pale gray to something closer to green, the particular yellow-green that old-timers called a cold front sky, and which Caleb had learned years ago to treat as seriously as a man pointing a rifle at you. The wind died for about 20 minutes, which was the worst sign of all. When the wind dies in the mountains before a storm, it means the storm is gathering itself. "We're not making the ranch tonight," he said. Clara looked at the sky. "How far are we?" 22 miles, give or take. "In good conditions, 4 hours. In what's coming?" He shook his head. "There's a line shack at the base of the Donahue slope. Belongs to a man named Aldous. He won't be up there this time of year. We can shelter there. Will Harlan's men follow in a storm?" "Depends how badly Harlan wants you back." She didn't answer that. He thought about what he knew of Harlan, which was more than he'd ever sought to know. Victor Harlan was 61 years old and had been building his territory for 30 years by the simple method of never letting anything he wanted slip out of his hands once he'd decided he wanted it. He wasn't the kind of man who accepted that weather had stopped his riders. He was the kind of man who accepted results, and the result he expected was Clara Whitmore brought back to Black Hollow. The wind came back with a vengeance about 40 minutes later. came sideways, full of ice crystals that weren't quite snow yet, more like the sky throwing gravel. And it hit the horses hard enough that Caleb had to fight the reins to keep them from turning. Clara reached over, without being asked, and held the left rein with both hands, adding her weight to his, and together they kept the team pointed north. "Don't let go," he said. "I'm not planning to," she said. It took them 2 hours to cover 6 miles. By the time the Donahue slope appeared through the weather, Caleb's hands were numb enough that he could feel the reins, but not feel his grip on them, which was his distinction that mattered. Clara's lips were pressed flat with cold, and the blanket around her shoulders had gotten wet and was doing only so much. The shack was exactly where he remembered. A low single-room structure built into the hillside with a soffit and a chimney that he could barely see in the weather, but knew was there. He pulled the horses to a halt and got them tied to the lean-to post on the shack's east side, which gave them some wind shelter, then threw feed from the wagon's emergency bag over each of them before he did anything else. Clara was already at the shack door by the time he turned around. She'd found the latch a simple bar drop and had it open, and she was inside and had found the fire materials before he crossed the threshold. There was wood stacked against the east wall, not much enough for a night, maybe into tomorrow if they were careful. A small iron stove in the corner with a box of matches on its top, someone's old careful provision that Caleb silently thanked whoever had left it. A rope cot with a canvas mattress, a 3-legged stool, 2 tin cups hung on a nail. Nothing else. Clara had the stove door open and was building a fire with focused, unhurried movements. He watched her for a second before he understood she'd done this before. Not learned it recently, but had it in her hands from childhood. The way she laid the smaller pieces first, the angle of the starter kindling. She wasn't performing competence. She just had it. He brought in what he could from the wagon. The blankets, the canteen, some of the dried provisions he kept for emergencies. He pulled the wagon canvas tighter against the supplies and hoped the storm wouldn't strip it. By the time he came back inside, there was a small fire going, and Clara was sitting on the floor near it, close enough to feel it, but not close enough to crowd it. Smart. The fire needed to breathe before it could give real heat. He sat on the 3-legged stool, put his hands near the stove. "Harlan's going to know we didn't make the main road," he said. "He'll figure we sheltered somewhere. He'll have men on the road as soon as the storm breaks." "I know." She looked up at him. In the firelight, with the bruise and the dried blood at the corner of her lip, she looked older than she had that morning. Not old, just older. Like the day had taken something and replaced it with something heavier. "Mr. Mercer, I want to say something, Caleb," he said. Paused. "What, you keep calling me Mr. Mercer? My father was Mr. Mercer. I've been Caleb for 39 years. Caleb." She held the word for a second, like she was making sure of it. "I'm not going to tell you this is a fair situation for you. It isn't. Harlan will come after you for this. When a man like that decides someone crossed him, he doesn't let it go. I know that. I'm saying I understand if you want to put me on a road somewhere. Point me toward a town and let me figure the rest out." He looked at the fire for a moment. "Where would you go?" She didn't answer, which was the answer. "You said the land borders his eastern range," he said. "And the river on it is the only year-round water source in that valley." "Yes, so without that land his expansion is stopped. He can't run more than half the cattle he wants to, without that water in summer." Caleb nodded slowly. "Which means the land is worth more to him than whatever he'd get selling it. Which means this isn't just about the debt being paid. He wants to hold it permanently. The marriage," she said. "If I'm his wife, the land is legally his. Not just bought absorbed. No separate ownership. No future claims." He'd understood that already, but hearing it said plainly made something harden in him that had been soft all day. He'd been thinking of this as a man taking something he wanted. He was beginning to understand it was a man building something piece by piece, family by family, signature by signature, and that Clara Whitmore's land was just the next piece in a structure that had been under construction for decades. "How many other families," he said, "that he's done this to?" "Or something like it," she thought. "3 that I know of. The Hendersons sold their North Range 2 years ago for what everyone said was a fair price. But Delia Henderson told me privately that the fair price came after 6 months of their cattle mysteriously dying and their well going bad. Purcell family old, Pete Purcell, he had a debt that appeared out of nowhere after his son left for Denver. He sold in the spring." She paused, "and the Marsh widow." She just gave up, moved to her sister's place in Laramie. I don't know what he did to her exactly, but she wouldn't talk about it. Caleb turned the stool slightly and put his back to the corner so he could see both the door and the stove. Old habit, that's a pattern. I know it's a pattern. But knowing it and proving it are different things. Your letter proves your father had no debt when he was alive. My letter proves what my father said about himself. Harlan will say my father lied, or that he forgot the debt because he was sick, or that the letter was written before the borrowing happened. She shook her head. Against the county clerk and the circuit judge and every man who owes Harlan a favor in 4 counties, which is most of them. My father's letter is just a piece of paper. The storm hit the shack's walls with a sound like a fist. Stovepipe rattled. Caleb said, "Is there anyone in the county who isn't in Harlan's pocket?" Clara thought for a long time. "There's a circuit judge out of Casper. Judge Aldrich. He's federal appointed. Harlan doesn't have any reach into the federal appointments." "How do you know that?" "Because 3 years ago, Harlan tried to have Aldrich removed for ruling against one of his water claims. The ruling stood. Aldrich kept his position. Harlan was," she almost smiled again, that brief, unwilling flicker. "People said he didn't leave his house for a week." Caleb filed that away. "Casper is 130 miles. I know, in winter. I know that too." The fire had grown enough to throw real heat now, and the shack had shrunk in the best way. The cold pushed back, the space around them small and manageable. The storm outside was fully committed, wind and snow both, the kind of sound that made everything inside feel deliberate and chosen. "Get some sleeps," Caleb said. She looked at the rope cot, then at him. "What about you?" "I'll sit a while. You should sleep too." "I'll sit a while," he said again. And there was something in it that wasn't arguable, so she didn't argue. She took the dry blanket he passed her, lay down on the cot without taking her boots off. The letter in her left boot, he remembered, and was quiet. He sat, listened to the storm, and thought about the road north and what would be waiting on it when the weather broke. He did sleep eventually, not on the cot but slumped against the corner wall, with his hat pulled over his face, one hand resting on his knee and the other near his side where his revolver was holstered. It was the kind of sleep that is more resting than dreaming, aware of every creak and shift in the building, the mind never fully letting go. He woke before dawn because the storm had changed. Not stopped changed. The howling had softened to a steady push, the frantic edge gone out of it. That meant the worst had passed. That meant the roads would start clearing by mid-morning. That meant Harlan's men would be moving by noon. He stood, checked the horses' still sound, eating the last of the feed he'd left them, and came back inside to find Clara already awake and sitting on the edge of the cot with her arms around her knees. She'd been awake for a while. He could tell. Her eyes had that specific flatness of someone who's been alone with their thoughts long enough to go through the frightening ones and come out the other side. "Storm's breaking," he said. "I heard it change." He stirred the stove, found one more piece of wood, and put it in. "We leave in an hour. The snow will be deep on the slope, but the horses can manage it." "Caleb." She said his name with weight, the way she'd said it the night before. He looked at her. "Why are you doing this?" "You don't know me. You had nothing to do with any of this before yesterday morning." He thought about lying, giving her a simple answer that would close the question. He thought about the various simple answers he could give, that he was in it now and may as well see it through, or that Harlan was the kind of problem the territory didn't need, or something about principle. All of it was true in pieces. "I had a wife," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. Clara went very still. 7 years ago. Her name was Margaret. We had the ranch. It was smaller then. 2 rooms and a well that wasn't reliable yet. He looked at the stove rather than at her. She got sick in January, fever. By the time I understood how serious it was, the road was closed. Snow had been coming for 2 weeks, and I waited too long to go for the doctor, because I kept thinking she'd turn the corner on her own. He was quiet for a second. She didn't. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "I spent a long time after that being the kind of man who stays out of things," he said. "Minded my own land, minded my own business. Told myself it was practical. Told myself getting involved in other people's problems was how you ended up with problems you couldn't solve." He glanced up at her. Then a man hit a woman in a general store, and not one person moved. Clara held his gaze. "I didn't move either," he said. "I heard it, and I kept my eyes where they were. And then I walked out, and I was about to drive away, and I thought." He stopped. "I thought Margaret would have moved. She was that kind of person. She'd have gotten herself hit for her trouble, probably, but she'd have moved. The last piece of wood caught and threw a line of orange across the shack floor. "I'm not doing this for you," he said. "Or not only. I'm doing it because I've been the man who looks away for 7 years, and I'm tired of it." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind pressed against the shack walls, but with less conviction than before. "Then I'm glad I hid in your wagon," she said. He stood, put his hat on, picked up the blankets to pack. "Get your boots on. Let's move." They made 15 miles before they saw the riders. There were 4 of them this time, not one, spread across the trail in a line that was designed to prevent simple passing. They'd come up from the east, not from Black Hollow behind them, which meant Harlan had sent men around, anticipated the Kettle Fork route, or something close to it, and positioned people ahead rather than behind. That was not the move of a man who was going to let this go. Caleb pulled the horses to a stop. The 4 riders held their positions. The one in the center was older than the others, gray-bearded, heavy through the shoulders. Ket's the settled look of a man who had done difficult things before and had learned to approach them without urgency. He wore no Harlan brand patch, which was in some ways worse. Harlan's ranch hands were hired labor. This man had the look of something else. "Mercer," the man said. He knew Caleb's name, which meant they'd been thorough in their asking around. "I'm going to keep this simple." "Go ahead," Caleb said. "The woman in your wagon. She belongs to Mr. Harlan under a legal arrangement. You can hand her over now, ride to your ranch, and this is the end of it for you. Mr. Harlan has no quarrel with you personally." Caleb looked at the man, looked at the 3 riders flanking him, looked at the trail, which was narrow here, deep with new snow, with a slope rising on one side and a drop into a ravine on the other. "That woman," Caleb said, "is a free citizen of Wyoming territory. She belongs to herself." The gray-bearded man tilted his head slightly. "That's going to be an expensive thing to believe, Mr. Mercer," probably, Caleb said. He held his position. The riders held theirs. The horses, his and theirs, stamped and breathed steam into the cold air. Clara sat beside him on the wagon seat in plain view. She had not hidden when the riders appeared. He hadn't told her to, and she hadn't offered to, and neither of them had commented on that. She sat straight, her bruised face forward, the wool blanket across her shoulders. The gray-bearded man looked at her. She looked back at him without flinching. The man said to her, "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Harlan is prepared to discuss the terms of the arrangement if you come back voluntarily. He said to tell you the matter of the land can be." "Tell him," Clara said, and her voice was flat and clear in the cold air, "that my father's letter will reach a federal judge before the first thaw, and what comes after that is no longer something Mr. Harlan can arrange." The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He looked at Caleb. "You're making an enemy." "I've had enemies before," Caleb said. "Some of them even showed up to be problems. Move your horses." The gray-bearded man considered for a long, deliberate moment. Then he said something quietly to the rider on his left, and the line opened, not fully, not generously, but enough for the wagon to pass if Caleb took it carefully and didn't rush. Caleb didn't rush. He kept his pace even, and his hands steady and his eyes forward. As they cleared the last rider, he heard the gray-bearded man say, "Just loud enough to carry. He'll send more than 4 next time." Caleb didn't answer. The wagon moved north. Clara beside him said nothing for half a mile. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, but steadier than he'd expected. "That was either very brave," she said, "or very stupid." "Can be both," he said. She considered that. "Yes," she said. "Suppose it can." The mountains closed around them again, and the ranch was still 12 miles ahead. And behind them somewhere, Victor Harlan was receiving a report that was not going to improve his mood. But the road was open, and the horses were sound. And Caleb Mercer had made his choice the moment he lifted a piece of canvas and looked at a pair of frightened brown eyes. He was done looking away. The ranch appeared through the tree line in the late afternoon, when the light had gone thin and colorless, and the snow on the ground was casting everything in a pale blue that made distances hard to judge. Clara saw it before he pointed it out. She didn't say anything. At first just looked at it the way a person looks at something they've been holding in their mind as an abstraction and are now meeting as a real thing. A main house, 2 stories, the upper windows dark. A barn that needed paint on the south wall. A fence line running east that had been repaired in sections, the newer posts noticeably straighter than the old ones. A well with a wooden cover weighted down by a flat stone. Smoke from no chimney because there was no fire. Because Caleb Mercer had driven to Black Hollow alone and come back with more than he'd bargained for. He stopped the wagon in front of the barn and got down without ceremony. His legs had gone stiff on the final stretch, and he didn't try to hide the way he moved for the first few steps, carefully, like a man remembering where his joints were. "The horses first," he said. "Then we get a fire going." Clara climbed down from the seat and went to the near horse's head without being asked, holding the bridle while Caleb unhooked the traces. She'd watched him do it twice on the road and had the sequence right. He noticed that and didn't comment on it. The barn was cold, but out of the wind, which was the thing that mattered. He got both horses into their stalls, got their tack off, got them fed and watered with the methodical efficiency of a man who had done these exact movements 10,000 times. Clara moved around him without crowding him, finding the things he needed before he asked. The brush on the post, the feed bucket, the blanket for the larger horse who had worked harder on the grade. "He favors the left front," she said, watching the horse. Caleb looked. The animal was standing square, but there was something slightly off in the way he distributed his weight. "Since when?" "Last 2 miles or so. I noticed it on the final slope." He ran his hand down the horse's left foreleg, found heat just above the fetlock. Not bad, not an injury, just the beginning of strain. But it needed attention before it became something worse. "You know horses?" he said. "My mother had 3. I grew up with them." He worked the leg for a few minutes, feeling for the specific quality of the heat, then satisfied himself it was manageable. "I'll wrap it tonight. He'll be fine in a few days." "Do you have liniment?" "Somewhere in the tack room." "I can look. It's on the second shelf, left side, brown bottle with a cracked label." She found it in under 2 minutes. He wrapped the leg with strips of old flannel while she held the horse steady, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. The barn felt in that odd way of practical shared work, almost normal. The house was cold in the way houses get when they've been closed up for days and dropping temperatures. Not just the air, but the walls themselves, the floor, the furniture, all of it holding the cold the way stone holds it. Caleb got a fire in the main room's hearth, going first, then the kitchen stove, and the process took the better part of an hour because the flue in the hearth had a partial blockage of creosote that needed clearing before it would draw properly. He was on his knees at the hearth with a brush and a bad angle on the problem when he heard Clara moving around in the kitchen. He heard the water pump working, the indoor pump he'd rigged from the well line 3 years ago, one of the few improvements he'd made to the house that he felt actually good about, and the sound of tin pots being found and evaluated. "What do you have?" she called. "Dried beans in the crock by the window. Salt pork on the hook in the pantry. Flour. Cornmeal. Whatever else was in the supplies I bought. I'm going to make soup." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." A pause. "Do you want soup or not?" He turned back to the flue. "Soup's fine." The blockage gave way about 20 minutes later, with a sound like a small avalanche inside the chimney and a cloud of soot that got into his eyes and mouth and hair. He sat back, blinking, and when he could see clearly again, the fire had taken hold properly, and the heat was real and moving. He washed his face at the kitchen pump. Clara was at the stove with her back to him, stirring something that already smelled better than anything that had been cooked in this house in recent memory. She'd found an apron on the hook by the door margarettes, he realized, and felt a complicated thing that he let pass through him without examining. He sat down at the kitchen table. It was a plain table, solid 2 chairs. He'd eaten at it alone for 7 years. The second chair had always been there. He'd never moved it and never quite understood why. "There's bread flour in the bag I brought in," he said. "I saw it. I'll make biscuits if there's enough fat. There's lard in the pantry." She found it. He watched her work without making a production of watching, just noting the way he noted things, the way a person moves when they're in an unfamiliar kitchen and either freezing up or adapting. She adapted. Opened the wrong drawer twice, found the right one on the 3rd try, didn't curse or apologize for it, just adjusted. The soup was ready in an hour, and the biscuits 20 minutes after that. They ate at the table with the fire going in both rooms now, and the house beginning slowly to be a temperature that didn't require an effort of will to tolerate. The food was good. Not fancy salts, pork and beans and biscuits was not fancy food, but it was made with attention. The beans properly salted, the pork not overdone, the biscuits with a crust on the bottom. That meant the heat had been right. He ate 2 helpings without intending to. "You've cooked for more than yourself before," he said. "My father. And sometimes the hands we had when the ranch was running better." She tore a piece of biscuit. "I like cooking for more than one person. It feels less." She stopped. "Less what?" "Pointless," she said. "Cooking for one feels like maintenance. Cooking for someone else feels like something." He understood that more than he wanted to admit out loud, so he didn't. He gave her the upper room, the one at the back of the house that had been a guest room for the 2 years. The ranch had functioned as a place that received guests before it became just a place that received him. There was a bed in it with a frame he'd built and a mattress that was adequate, and 2 quilts he brought up from the chest in the main room. He also brought a candle and a box of matches and left them on the small table by the bed. She stood in the doorway looking at it. "It's not much," he said. "It's more than the wagon," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and went back downstairs, sat by the fire for a while, with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, going through in his mind the geography of what had happened and what was likely to happen next. Harlan had 4 riders who knew the Kettle Fork route or close to it. He'd had a gray-bearded man with the look of someone who made decisions, which meant not just hired hands, someone Harlan trusted with judgment. That kind of man wouldn't stop at one blocked road. The ranch was 40 miles from Black Hollow. In winter, with snow on the ground, that was a serious distance. Not impossible. Harlan's riders had proven that today, but it required commitment. If Harlan sent men in force across 40 miles of winter road, it became a statement. Stopped being about retrieving a woman and became about not being defied. Caleb had told the gray-bearded man that he'd made an enemy. He'd said it casually, which was how he handled most things, but he'd meant it as a calculation. Men like Harlan did not tolerate being held publicly in contempt. The scene with Clara and the riders 4 of Harlan's men letting a wagon pass because a man and woman on a wagon seat stared them down. That story would get around. In places like this, stories got around. They traveled faster than riders. He put more wood on the fire and went to check the window on the north side of the house. The night was clear. The storm had blown through completely and left a sky full of stars, and a ground full of snow that reflected enough light to see by. The road coming from the south was visible for about half a mile before it curved into the trees. Nothing on it. Not yet. He went to bed at midnight, left his boots on. The first week established itself in routines neither of them had designed. Caleb woke before first light out of habit. He had the stoves going and the horses fed before Clara came downstairs. Came down and made breakfast without discussion of who was responsible for what, just because she was there and the food needed making, and she apparently found idleness harder to tolerate than anything else. He worked the property through the morning. She worked inside, and they reconvened at noon, and sometimes again in the evening, and the division was not planned, and not permanent, and not anything either of them named. On the second day, she found the broken gear coupling on the secondary pump and told him about it. He went and looked. She was right. The coupling had cracked in the freeze, and the pump couldn't build pressure. He had a spare coupling in the tool shed somewhere. He spent 2 hours finding it. She sat with him on the floor of the shed while he went through boxes and said nothing. And when he finally located it under a piece of leather tack, she said, "There it is, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had decided to be patient and been rewarded." He installed the coupling. The pump worked. On the 4th day, she asked if she could look at the fence line on the east side of the property. He said it wasn't in great repair, but it was standing. She said she'd noticed one of the posts was leaning toward the ravine, and if it went, the whole section would follow. He'd been meaning to look at it for 2 months. He said she could come out when he checked the horses if she wanted, and she did. The post was worse than he'd thought. She'd been right about the lean. The ground around it had heaved in the freeze and refrozen improperly, and the post was going to go with the next hard wind. He dug it out and reset it. She handed him tools and packed the ground down with her boot heel on his instruction, and neither of them said much about it because neither of them was the type to narrate what they were doing while they did it. He was beginning to understand one of the things about her. She didn't narrate. She didn't fill silences because she was uncomfortable with them. She moved through a day with a quietness that wasn't timidity. It was a different thing, more like economy, the habit of someone who had learned to spend herself carefully because there wasn't always someone to replenish the reserve. He recognized it because he was the same way. On the 5th day, he found her in the barn with the injured horse, rewrapping the leg with strips of fresh flannel she'd torn from one of her own underskirt's material that was finer than what he would have used, softer, less likely to bunch and cause friction. "Cut up your own?" he started. It needed a better wrap. She tied the end and didn't look up. "The flannel you used was too thick. It was putting pressure on the tendon instead of supporting it." He looked at the horse's leg. The wrap was neater than his had been, more even. "It was my only spare underskirt," she added, and there was something slightly wry in it that he hadn't quite heard from her before. "So I'd appreciate if this horse heals quickly." He almost laughed. Not quite, but close enough that he recognized the sensation. The snow stayed through the 2nd week, and the isolation should have felt heavier than it did. Caleb had spent winters alone in this house before, and knew exactly the quality of the silence. How it went from peaceful to oppressive somewhere around the 12th day. How he'd start noticing sounds he'd never paid attention to, and assigning them too much meaning. Creak of the settling walls. The particular tone of wind through the gap he'd never fixed above the north window. Clara in the house, the silence had a different texture. It was still quiet. They were not people who talked constantly. But it was the quiet of two people existing in the same space rather than one person filling an empty one. And the difference was larger than he would have predicted. She found Margaret's books on the shelf in the upper hall. He saw her looking at the spines one evening when he came up to get the lamp she'd forgotten on the landing. "You can read them," he said, before she could ask or not ask. Turned. "Were they yours or my wife's? She brought them from her family's house in Ohio when we married." Clara looked at the shelf again. There were 11 books. He knew them by their spines without reading the titles. Margaret had arranged them by color, a system that made no logical sense, and that he'd never rearranged, because the colors were how he remembered her hands moving along them. "What was she like?" Clara said. "Stubborn," he said. Funnier than she seemed at first. She had a way of saying something completely ordinary, and making it mean 3 other things at once. He stopped. "She was better with people than I am." "Most people probably are," Clara said, and there was something gentle in it that made it not an insult. He gave her the lamp and went back downstairs. She picked a book, a collection of stories by an Eastern writer he'd never read. He heard her up there at night, the faint rustle of pages. The trouble arrived on the 14th day. Not Harlan's riders, not yet. Something else, and in some ways worse. It was one of Caleb's nearest neighbors, a man named Roy Fenwick, who had a ranch 6 miles to the southeast, and who Caleb had known for the better part of a decade in the way frontier neighbors know each other. Well enough to borrow a tool in an emergency, not well enough to share a meal unless circumstance forced it. Fenwick came up the south road on horseback in the mid-morning, with his hat pulled low and his coat buttoned to the throat, and an expression that had been organized in advance to look casual. Caleb saw him coming from 200 yards out and went to the porch to meet him. "Caleb," Fenwick said, pulling his horse up. "Roy, cold enough for you?" "It's December," Caleb said. "What do you need?" Fenwick looked at the house, at the smoke from 2 chimneys, at the window where, if he looked carefully, there was a figure visible, Clara, who had appeared at the glass, and then stepped back when she saw the visitor. "Heard you had company," Fenwick said. "You heard that in 6 miles of snow." Fenwick looked back at him. The casual expression was doing less work now. "Harlan sent a man around to the ranches last week, telling people you'd taken something of his, that there'd be a reward for what?" Caleb said. His voice was even. "For information. If anyone saw a young woman traveling with you." Fenwick paused. "He's calling it a legal matter. Says the woman is party to a contract." "She's not. I'm not saying she is. I'm saying Harlan said it. And he said it to everyone along this road, and he mentioned your name specifically." Fenwick shifted in the saddle. He was uncomfortable. That was honest, at least. "I'm not here to make trouble, Caleb. I'm here because I got a family. 3 kids and a wife, and I got a note from Harlan's man that said my water rights on the South Fork need to be re-reviewed. Hasn't been an issue for 8 years, but now all of a sudden," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Caleb looked at him for a long moment, took in the reddened nose, the hands that weren't quite steady on the reins, the eyes that kept sliding away. "You're telling me he's using your water rights?" To get you to tell him what you know, Caleb said. I'm telling you I've got a family, and I'm not arguing that. Caleb stepped off the porch and walked to where Fenwick's horse stood. He kept his voice low. Roy, look at me. Fenwick looked. If you go back to Harlan's man and tell him I've got a woman here, Harlan's going to come to this ranch. And when he comes to this ranch, what happens here is going to happen whether you told him or not. Because he already knows. He's going to know soon enough. Because he's the kind of man who finds out things. The only question is whether you told him first. Fenwick was listening. But if you go back and say you don't know anything, which is what you can honestly say, because you don't know anything beyond smoke from two chimneys, your water rights stay the same trouble they already were. Harlan hasn't pulled them yet. He's using the threat. There's a difference. He'll know I came up here. Maybe. But coming to check on a neighbor in winter isn't unusual. Fenwick was quiet for a long time. The horse stamped. Cold air held both of them. What are you going to do? Fenwick finally said. What I have to, Caleb said. Same as you. It wasn't an answer, and both of them knew it, and it was also the only answer that existed. Fenwick looked at the house one more time. Then he turned his horse and rode back south without another word. Caleb stood and watched him go. Clara was at the door when he came back inside. She'd heard enough. He'll tell Harlan, she said. Eventually. Not today. He took his coat off, hung it by the door. But we have less time than I thought. She followed him into the main room. He stood by the fire, working through it. The letter in your boot, he said. You said your father had it witnessed in Casper. Yes, a man named Elias Webb. He ran a print shop on the main street. Is Webb still alive? I don't know. He was maybe 60 last I saw him. That was 3 years ago. If he's alive and we can get a copy of what he witnessed, that's corroboration. The letter alone is your father's claim. The letter plus the witness is a documented statement. He looked at her. And you said there might be other families Harlan's done this to. At least 3 that I know of. If even one of them kept something. Anything that shows a pattern. He turned to the window. The south road was empty. Fenwick's tracks already beginning to soften in the weak afternoon sun. A federal judge doesn't look at one family's complaint the same way he looks at a case that touches 5 or 6. Clara sat down on the edge of the chair nearest the fire. Not relaxed, precise, like she was saving herself for what was next. You're talking about building something. I'm talking about making a case that's bigger than just your land. Because if it's just your land, Harlan beats it. He's got the county clerk and the local court and enough money to delay a proceeding for 5 years. But if it's pattern, if it's something that reaches into federal jurisdictions, he doesn't have reach into federal appointments, she said. She'd told him that about Judge Aldrich in Casper. That's what you said. That's what's true as far as I know. He nodded. Then what we need is time to build it. And what Harlan is going to do is take that time away. She looked at the fire. He could see her working through it, not panicking, which he'd noticed about her from the beginning. She processed things with a certain internal steadiness that coexisted with real fear. She felt things. She just didn't let the feeling arrive before the thinking. How much time do you think we have? She said. Before he comes here? Maybe a week. Could be less if Fenwick talks sooner than I expect. And we can't go to Casper in a week. Not in this snow. Not the whole way. But I can get word to someone. He paused. There's a man in the next valley who runs a courier service in summer and traps in winter. He knows these mountains well enough to travel when nobody else can. His name is Holt. If I can reach him, I can get a letter to Casper, to Judge Aldrich's clerk. A letter saying what? Caleb looked at her. That a woman is making a formal complaint of fraud and coercion against Victor Harlan of Black Hollow, and that she has documentation, and that she is requesting the court's protection while the case is prepared. Clara was quiet. If Aldrich's clerk receives that letter and logs it, even just logs it, it makes Harlan's next move harder. If he comes here with armed men after a letter has been filed in federal court, he's not enforcing a private contract anymore. He's obstructing a federal proceeding. You know law, she said. It was somewhere between a statement and a question. I know enough. My father was a county justice in Indiana before we came west. He talked at the table. He let that sit. I'm not a lawyer. But I know there's a difference between a man acting like he owns the law and a man who actually has to answer to it. Stood up, went to the window. The afternoon light was failing, the shadows going long across the snow. I have names, she said, of the families, the Hendersons, Purcells. The Marsh widow, her name was Eleanor. She turned. If I write to them, If we can get letters out at the same time. One thing at a time, he said. First I have to reach Holt, and Holt has to be willing. Will he be? Caleb thought about Silas Holt, who he'd known for 4 years and who had no strong opinions about much of anything except the quality of his traps and the fairness of his trades, who had done business in 3 counties and never picked sides in anything, who was not a brave man exactly, but who was a fair one. He doesn't like Harlan, Caleb said. Harlan tried to block a trade route Holt uses through the South Pass 2 years ago. Holt had to go around. Cost him a week and 2 mules. He almost smiled. Men remember a lost mule. He left for Holt's place the next morning before Clara was awake. He left a note on the kitchen table plain, not explaining much, just the time he expected to be back, and the instruction that if anyone came to the property, she should stay inside and say nothing. He debated leaving the note at all, and then debated its tone, and settled on plain because anything warmer would have felt strange, and anything colder would have felt unkind. And by the time he'd sorted it out, he'd spent 8 minutes on a note that said 4 sentences. He rode hard and got to Holt's cabin by mid-morning. Holt was at his workbench repairing a trap mechanism, which was what Holt was usually doing in December. Caleb explained it straight, no decoration. Holt listened, picked at the trap mechanism, asked one question. This going to bring Harlan onto my business? Probably not. You're just a courier. You don't know the contents of what you carry. I usually do know. This time you don't. Holt thought about it. 2 mules, he said. What? Cost me 2 mules going around that pass. He set the trap down. What kind of fee are we talking? I'll pay you in beef. 2 sides, come spring. Holt considered. Cash is better. Cash in the spring when I sell. You might not make spring. If I don't, you've lost nothing, because you haven't done the job yet. Holt picked up the trap again, turned it over. When do you need the letters to leave? Within 3 days. That's fast for winter riding to Casper. I know, 2 sides of beef and a bottle of rye. Done. Caleb spent an hour at Holt's table writing the letter to Judge Aldrich's clerk. He wrote it twice once to get it right and once cleanly on fresh paper, and he chose every word with the kind of care his father had taught him, the kind that builds weight without ornamentation, that says a thing and doesn't lean on snacing of it. He named Clara Whitmore. He named the property. He named Victor Harlan. He named the specific claims fraud, coercion, a forged debt instrument, and attached to the letter a sealed copy of Clara's father's notarized document, which Clara had let him read the previous evening, and which he had copied word for word in his own hand, noting the original's provenance. He sealed the letters with wax from Holt's candle. Holt took them without ceremony and said he'd ride in 2 days, weather permitting. On the ride back to the ranch, Caleb stopped at the top of the ridge and looked south. The road from Black Hollow was visible in sections, appearing between the tree lines like a thread pulled through a needle. Empty, still empty, but it wouldn't be empty much longer. He rode back down to the ranch, put his horse up, and came inside to find Clara at the kitchen table with a lamp and a piece of paper, writing. She looked up. I started letters to the Henderson family in Eleanor Marsh, she said. I didn't know if you'd agree to send them, but I thought. I'll take them to Holt when they're done, he said. He's leaving in 2 days. She looked at him. Something moved through her face, not relief exactly, more like the specific kind of gratitude that comes from being taken seriously. The Purcells are harder, she said. I don't have an address for them in Denver. I'll ask around. Someone will know. She turned back to her writing. He sat down across from her and looked at the lamp between them, the circle of light it made, the 2 sets of hands in that light, hers moving and his still. Outside, the wind was picking up again. Not a storm, just the ordinary voice of a Wyoming winter, steady and indifferent, requiring nothing of anyone except that they stay where they'd decided to stay. Caleb put a piece of wood in the kitchen stove and sat back down. There was work to do. There was always work to do on this ranch. But this was a different kind of work from anything he'd done in the last 7 years, and he sat with that for a moment. The strangeness of it, the weight of it, and underneath both of those, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. The feeling that what he did today was going to matter. On the 17th day, they came. Not Harlan's riders. Harlan himself. Caleb saw the group from the north window in the early afternoon Sefton horses coming up the south road, at a pace that was neither rushed nor casual, the pace of a procession. 6 riders, and 1 man at the center on a gray horse, who sat the saddle, with the particular straightness of a man who expected the world to notice him. Victor Harlan was 61 and rode like he was 50 and owned like he was 100. He was not a large man, medium height, medium build, the kind of man who looks ordinary until you notice how the men around him arrange themselves in relation to him without being told. The gray-bearded man from the mountain road was there, riding 2 lengths behind. So were 4 others, armed and visible about it. Clara came to stand beside Caleb at the window. She said nothing. Her jaw was set. The bruise on her face had faded to yellow and green at the edges, which somehow looked worse than the original purple had. "Go upstairs," he said. "No," she said. He turned. "Clara, I heard you the first time," she said. "I'm not going upstairs." He looked at her face, at the set of it, understood that this was not stubbornness in the obstructive sense, but stubbornness in the load-bearing sense, the kind that holds a structure up. "Then stay back from the window," he said. "Let me open the door." He went out onto the porch as the riders came into the yard. He did not have his rifle in his hands. He did not have it was inside the door, visible through the glass if anyone looked. But he stood with his thumbs in his belt in a way that made certain things clear about where his hands were and where they weren't. Harlan pulled his horse to a stop 20 feet out, looked at the house, looked at Caleb, Mr. Mercer. His voice was what Caleb had expected, measured, almost pleasant, the kind of voice that has practiced keeping its edges smooth. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I don't," Caleb said. "A young woman, Clara Whitmore. She's party to a legal agreement. She's a free woman, and this is my property," Caleb said. "You're on it without invitation." Harlan looked at him the way a man looks at a door he's decided to push through. Patient, certain of the outcome. "I understand you may have formed an attachment to the girl. That's human, I suppose. But this isn't about sentiment. This is about a legally binding contract that her father entered into while he was of sound mind." "Her father's handwriting crossed his 7s, Caleb said. Harlan paused, fractional, barely visible. "The signature on your contract didn't," Caleb continued. "And there's a notarized accounting her father made that names no creditors, none, which a federal court in Casper has now received, along with a formal complaint." The yard was very quiet. The gray-bearded man shifted on his horse. Harlan's face did not change, not the main arrangement of it, but something behind his eyes did, a quick recalculation that he covered well but not perfectly. He was a man used to controlling information. Someone had gotten past his control. He was deciding in real time how serious that was. Then the door of the house opened behind Caleb. Clara stepped onto the porch. She stood beside him, not behind him, beside him. And she looked at Victor Harlan across the cold yard, with the particular expression of a woman who has been running and has decided, in this spot, to stop. "Mr. Harlan," she said. Her voice carried clearly. "I have nothing to give you. The land is mine. The debt is not real. And the next thing you do on this property will be the thing a federal judge hears about first." Harlan looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. "You've made a mistake," he said. He said it without anger, which was somehow worse than anger. "I've made a lot of them," she said. Getting into this man's wagon was not one of them. Harlan turned his horse, said something quiet to the gray-bearded man. Then, without another word to either of them, he rode back down the south road, his men falling in behind him, their tracks pressing deep into the snow. Caleb and Clara stood on the porch and watched until the last rider was out of sight. Then she went inside, and he heard her sit down at the kitchen table, and then he heard something that might have been a long, shuddering breath, the kind a person takes when they've been told themselves very straight for a very long time. He stayed on the porch another minute. Let the cold air do what cold air does. Harlan had come himself. He'd looked at the situation personally, which meant he was taking it seriously, which meant the letter had reached Casper, and he'd found out about it, which meant his network reached further than Caleb had accounted for, which meant what came next was not going to be a social visit. He went back inside. Clara was at the table, her hands flat on the surface, steadying herself. "He knows about the letter," she said. "Yes. What does that mean?" Caleb pulled out the other chair, sat across from her. "It means he's going to move faster now," he said. "And it means so do we." Harlan was back on the south road before the cold had fully left the porch boards, and Caleb stood there watching the empty trail long after the last rider had disappeared into the tree line, running the same calculation over and over, and arriving at the same uncomfortable answer each time. Harlan knew about the letter. That meant he had someone in Casper. Not a judge, not a clerk, but someone close enough to either of those things to hear what came across a desk and report it north. That was a more sophisticated operation than Caleb had given him credit for, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that the miscalculation was his own. He'd assumed federal distance meant federal safety. He'd been wrong, or at least not entirely right, which in the current situation amounted to the same thing. He went inside. Clara was still at the kitchen table, her hands no longer flat on the surface, but wrapped around a cup of water she wasn't drinking. "He has someone in Casper," Caleb said. "I know," which means Aldrich's clerk may have been told to sit on the filing. She looked up. Can he do that? Harlan can't tell a federal clerk what to do, but he can tell someone who knows someone to slow walk a piece of paper, lose it in a stack, flag it for review that never gets scheduled. He sat down. It buys him time. Then we've lost the advantage. We've lost one advantage. He put both hands on the table. The letter still exists. It was still filed, even if it's being delayed. That's a record. And Aldrich himself, if he's the man you described, the one who held his position when Harlan tried to have him removed, he doesn't strike me as someone who lets his clerk bury things indefinitely. But we don't know that. No, he said. We don't know that. She set the cup down, looked at the window. Outside, the afternoon had gone flat and gray, the kind of winter light that doesn't change for hours and makes it impossible to tell 3 o'clock from 5. What we need, she said slowly, is for the letter to not be the only pressure. He waited, if there were people, not just paper. People who went to Casper themselves, or to the county seat families that Harlan wronged, standing together in front of someone who had to write down what they said and put a date on it. She looked at him. Paper can be misfiled. People standing in a room are harder to lose. He thought about that. The Henderson family, the Purcells, Eleanor Marsh. 3 families he knew only through Clara's account of them, none of whom he had contact with, none of whom he'd spoken to. The letters Clara had written were sitting with Silas Holt, presumably delivered by now, hopefully read. But reading a letter is different from deciding to act on it, and acting on it in winter, with Harlan's network, covering the county, required a particular quality of desperation or courage, or both. "The Hendersons," he said. "You said Delia Henderson told you privately about the cattle dying and the well going bad." "Yes. Privately means she knew it was connected to Harlan. She knew. She just couldn't prove it, and her husband had already agreed to sell by the time she told me." Clara paused. She was angry in a way that had no outlet. You know that kind of angry, when you know something is wrong, and the knowing changes nothing. Did her husband share her view? Tom Henderson is a careful man. He believes in being careful. He believes if you do everything right and don't make enemies and stay inside the lines, the world mostly leaves you alone. She said it without judgment, which was itself a kind of judgment. After the sell, he didn't want to talk about it anymore. He wanted it to be over. But Delia didn't. Delia doesn't strike me as someone who lets things be over when they aren't. Caleb sat with that. What about the Purcells? Old Pete's son Marcus is in Denver. If Pete got my letter. She stopped. Pete's got a bad chest. He's been bad since last spring. I don't know if he's... She didn't finish that sentence either. Left it in the air where it belonged. Eleanor Marsh, he said. Eleanor moved to Laramie. She's with her sister. I wrote to her sister's address, but I don't know if they're still there. She rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that was tired rather than emotional. We're building on a lot of things we don't know. Everything starts that way, he said. She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was putting out a thin yellow light, the wick needing trimming. Neither of them moved to trim it. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. The document. My father's letter, the notarized one. "I told you it proves he had no creditors." She took a breath. "There's a second document. I didn't tell you about it before because I wasn't sure I trusted." She stopped. Started again. "Because I wasn't sure how far this was going, and I didn't want to put it in anyone else's hands until I understood where it was going." He said nothing. Let her take the time she needed. "When I left Black Hollow, I didn't only take the letter." She reached into the collar of her dress and pulled out a second piece of paper, folded small and flat, worn soft at the creases from being carried. She set it on the table between them. He looked at it, didn't touch it. "My father kept a record," she said. Not of his own affairs, of the conversations he had with Harlan. He was a careful man too, like Tom Henderson, but his version of careful was writing things down. He had a journal. He kept it in the false bottom of his writing desk. She nodded toward the paper. Before I left, I found it. That page is copied from it. 3 conversations dated with what Harlan said and what my father understood to be the terms. Caleb looked at the page, still didn't touch it. One of the conversations, Clara said, is about the river, the water source. Harlan told my father directly that the debt was structured so that the land, specifically the river corridor, would revert to Harlan's holding in the event of default. He said it like it was a normal term. My father wrote down that he'd thought it was hypothetical, that he didn't believe he was going to default because he didn't believe the debt was real. Her voice was very steady. He wrote, in his own words, that he suspected the debt had been arranged to fail, that Harlan had offered him credit at terms that looked reasonable, but were calculated to become unreasonable. The kitchen was very quiet. Why didn't you tell me this before? Caleb said. Because the first time I almost told someone something important, that person went directly to Harlan's man. She met his eyes. That was in Black Hollow 2 days before I ran. A woman I thought was a friend. He understood that, didn't argue with it. He picked up the page. Read it. His father had taught him to read legal documents, not with admiration for their structure, but with suspicion, looking for what they were designed not to say. This wasn't a legal document, but it had the quality of one date's names, specific language, the careful notation of a man who sensed he was in a current moving faster than it looked. This changes the case, he said. I know. This isn't just a fraudulent debt. This is documented predatory intent. He told your father what he was doing, in so many words, because he thought your father was too sick and too intimidated to act on it. He was mostly right, she said, and there was grief in it, but no bitterness. Just the honest weight of it. Mostly, Caleb said. He wrote it down. She looked at the paper in his hands. What do we do with it? The same thing we do with everything else. We make sure more than one person has a copy. We make sure it reaches Casper. And we make sure it reaches the other families. Because if Harlan used the same structure on the Hendersons or the Purcells, if there's a pattern of him explaining his own scheme because he thought no one would ever compare notes, then the comparisons do the work, she said. Then the comparisons do the work, he agreed. He put the document down, looked at her. You should have shown me this sooner. I know that now, she said. I'm showing you now. He nodded once. Let it be enough. The next 3 days were the most dangerous kind of quiet. The kind that feels like waiting but might be preparation. And there was no way to tell from inside it which one it was. Caleb made 2 copies of the journal page in his own hand, working at the kitchen table after Clara had gone to bed, his handwriting slow and deliberate, the way his father had taught him to copy important documents. He noted at the bottom of each copy that it was a transcription of a primary source held by Clara Whitmore, with the date and his own signature as the transcriber. It wasn't a legal instrument, but it was something. He sent 1 copy with a rider to Silas Holt the following morning, a boy from the Fenwick place, of all sources, who appeared at the ranch gate with a message from Roy Fenwick saying only that if Caleb needed a courier, he could use the boy. Roy didn't say anything about it. Caleb stood at the gate and looked at the message for a moment, thought about Roy Fenwick on his horse, looking at the house with the smoke from 2 chimneys. Thought about a man with 3 kids deciding what kind of man he was going to be about this. He paid the boy fairly and sent him to Holt with the copy and a covering note. He kept the second copy himself behind the second copy in the fireplace, where he kept the ranch's deed and his small amount of cash money. He'd kept things there for years. It was not a sophisticated hiding place, but it was one that required knowing the house to find. On the 4th day after Harlan's visit, a woman appeared on the North Road. That was unusual enough to bring Caleb to the window. Traffic from the north was rare in winter, the northern road being essentially impassable to wagons and difficult even on horseback. But she came through on a tough-looking roan mare with her coat buttoned high and a cloth bundle tied to the saddle, and she rode like someone who'd been riding difficult roads all her life and had opinions about it. Clara saw her at the same moment, came to stand at the window beside Caleb. "That's Delia Henderson," Clara said. He looked at her. "Sure? I'm sure." They went out to meet her. Delia Henderson was maybe 40, with the specific kind of weathered face that isn't aged so much as seasoned lines that came from squinting into wind, not from unhappiness. She pulled her horse up in the yard and looked at them both with sharp, dark eyes that did an immediate inventory. "You must be Mercer," she said to Caleb. Then to Clara, "You look better than I expected." "Your expectations were low," Clara said. "Your letter said you'd spend a night in a line shack in a blizzard." Delia dismounted. I had some basis. She'd ridden 60 miles in 4 days, which was not a comfortable distance in December on mountain roads. She'd told her husband she was visiting a sick cousin in the North Valley, which was a lie he may or may not have believed. She'd brought the bundle from her saddle inside without being asked, and set it on the kitchen table and opened it to reveal 3 items: a bound ledger, a stack of folded papers, and a small tin that turned out to contain dried apple slices. "The apples are for eating," she said. "The rest is what you asked for." She sat down at the table. Clara put water on. Caleb sat across from Delia and looked at the ledger. "Tom doesn't know you have that," he said. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. Tom made his peace with what happened. "I haven't." She put her hand on the ledger. "This was mine. Tom handled the land business and the debt negotiations and all of that. I handled the household accounts. I wrote down every expense, every income, every transaction for 16 years. She opened it to a marked page, including the 3 payments we made to Harlan's agent against the debt before Tom sold. Caleb looked at the entries. Neat, precise figures in a woman's careful hand. "The payments cleared," she said. "All 3 of them. I have the receipts." She tapped the folded papers. "But when Harlan's man came to discuss terms of the sale, he said we were still in arrears, that the interest had compounded in a way that meant the payments we made had only covered the interest, not the principal." Tom asked to see the calculation. They showed him a document. She paused. "It didn't match what I had in my ledger. The interest rate was different, higher, backdated to the beginning of the loan." "Backdated," Caleb said, "by about 8 months, just enough to make the math work the way they needed it to." Her voice was flat, the kind of flat that means anger has been held so long it's become structural. Tom thought he'd misremembered the original terms. I knew he hadn't, because I'd written them down the day we signed. But by then he'd already agreed to sell, and he didn't want to. She stopped. He didn't want the trouble. He said, "We couldn't prove it in fighting. It would cost more than the land was worth." "But it wasn't about the land's value to you," Clara said quietly. Delia looked at her. "No," she said, "it wasn't." Caleb turned the ledger pages carefully. The entries were exactly what she'd described, complete, dated, with amounts that matched the receipts exactly and contradicted Harlan's claimed interest rate at every point. It was not dramatic evidence. It was the kind of evidence that requires patience to understand, the kind that doesn't move people who don't want to be moved. But in front of a judge who was already looking at the question, it was the kind of evidence that made a pattern undeniable. "There's something else," Delia said. She reached into her coat and produced a separate folded paper. "After I got Clara's letter, I talked to Nora Purcell. Pete's daughter-in-law lives in Rawlins. She said Pete died in October." A moment of stillness at the table. Clara looked down. "But before he died, Marcus, Pete's son in Denver, came back for 2 weeks. And during those 2 weeks, Pete told Marcus everything about the debt. Marcus wrote it down." Delia set the paper on the table. "That's what Marcus wrote. Nora copied it for me." Caleb unfolded it. "Read it." Pete Purcell had told his son about a debt that appeared after his neighbor sold to Harlan. A debt Pete said he'd never agreed to, for work done on an irrigation ditch that Pete claimed had been offered as a neighborly gesture, not a commercial transaction. Harlan's man had appeared with a bill for the work 18 months after the fact, with a signed agreement that Pete said was not his signature. Not his signature. He set it down next to Clara's copy of her father's journal page. 2 forged signatures, different families, the same method. "Eleanor Marsh," he said to Delia. "I wrote to her sister. Haven't heard back." Delia poured herself water without asking. "But I know what happened to Eleanor without needing her to tell me. Harlan sent men onto her property 3 times in 2 months. They moved fence lines, spooked her horses. One of them told her," Delia stopped, started again. "One of them told her it would be easier if she didn't have the property to worry about. Eleanor is 62 years old, and she'd been on that land since she was 24. Kitchen was very quiet again. Outside, a branch somewhere gave under the weight of ice and snow and came down with a heavy crack that made all 3 of them look up. Just a branch. "We need to go to Casper," Clara said. "Not a letter." "Us," Caleb started, "is hard but not impossible. You and I made 40 miles in a storm. Casper is 130, but the southern road is maintained." She looked at him. And we need to go before Harlan decides the next step is something we can't walk back from. Delia was watching Caleb. He could feel her doing it, assessing him the way a woman assesses a man she's entrusting something important to, looking for the specific quality that's different from bravery and harder to fake. He's already pushing the county clerk, Caleb said, and he's got someone near Aldrich's office. If we walk into Casper as private citizens, we don't walk in as private citizens, Clara said. We walk in with a ledger, 2 documented forgeries, and a formal petition signed by 3 families. She looked at Delia. Will you sign? Delia didn't hesitate. That's why I rode 60 miles. Clara looked back at Caleb. He looked at the table, the ledger, the copies, the documents that were separately suggestive, and, together, something close to airtight if a fair eye examined them. I'll need 2 days to get the ranch set, he said. Feed laid in for the horses, the pipes insulated against a hard freeze. 2 days, Clara said, and we take the southern road straight. No detours, no back trails. We travel openly, Delia said, because if we sneak, we look guilty. If we ride straight down the main road in daylight, we're 3 people going to Casper on legitimate business. Harlan's men will see us. That's fine. Let them see us. He looked at Clara. By the time they report to Harlan, and Harlan decides what to do about it, we'll be inside a federal building. But Harlan didn't wait 2 days. He waited 1. The morning before they'd planned to leave, Caleb came downstairs at first light and found the south window's reflection, showing something wrong with the far fence line. He stood at the glass for a minute, working out what was wrong about it, and then he understood. The gate on the south entrance to the property was open. He'd closed and latched it the night before. He got his coat and rifle and went out. The gate was not just open. It had been forced, the latch broken. The post it was hinged on cracked at the base. The ground around it had too many tracks for 1 rider, maybe 4. Coming in and going back out recently, the tracks not yet softened by morning temperature. He followed the tracks into the yard. They went to the barn. He pushed the barn door open with his shoulder against the rifle. Empty, no one inside, but the near horse's stall was open. The horse was there, standing, but its tack had been gone through. Saddles pulled off their racks, a bridle on the floor. The feed had been cut open. The bags slit, the grain scattered across the floor in a way that was pure waste, done only to make a point. And the small locked chest where he kept his tools, the good ones, the ones that couldn't be easily replaced in winter, had been pried open and emptied. He stood in the barn for a moment, breathing. This was a message. Harlan had sent men in the night, not to take Clara, not to burn the place, but to leave evidence of entry, to demonstrate reach, to say, I can come here. I can go through your things. I can make this difficult in ways you can't entirely predict. He came back inside. Clara was at the top of the stairs, still in her sleeping clothes, reading his face as he came through the door. Barn, he said. Last night, nobody hurt, horses fine, but they went through everything. She came down the stairs. He told her what he'd found. She listened without interrupting. Tools, she said when he finished. Not the horses, not the supply stores. Right. They could have done more. Yes. So they didn't do more because Harlan doesn't want a destruction charge in front of a federal court. He wants pressure, not evidence against himself. Caleb looked at her. She'd gotten there faster than he had, and he'd been thinking it through for 10 minutes. He's careful, Caleb said. He's always been careful. That's how he's done this for 30 years. She crossed to the table and sat down, pulling her coat from the hook on the way. We leave today, not tomorrow. The ranch isn't. Caleb. She said his name the way she'd learned to say it, with enough weight that it stopped the next sentence without arguing with it. If we leave tomorrow, he does something else tonight. Something bigger. He's calibrating. Each thing he does is slightly worse than the last, and he stops just short of the line you'd need to make a charge stick. She put her coat on. We don't give him another night. He looked at the window. The light was still thin, the morning early. 2 hours to get the ranch, set enough to survive 3 or 4 days without him. Feed laid in, pipes wrapped, neighbor notified. And the only neighbor he trusted with this, now, was Roy Fenwick, which was not a comfort, but was better than nothing. I'll saddle the horses, he said. I'll get Delia. Delia had been awake. Since before Caleb went to the barn, she'd heard something in the night, she said, and had lain still trying to decide if she'd dreamed it. When Clara knocked on the guest room door and told her what had happened and what they were doing, Delia dressed in 4 minutes and came downstairs with her coat buttoned and her bundle under her arm, and a look on her face that was not afraid, but was honest about what it was dealing with. "How long to Casper?" she said. "3 days if the road's clear," Caleb said. "Could be 4. Then we'd better move." They were out of the yard before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. The 3 of them on horseback, Caleb on his larger horse, Clara on the roan Delia had ridden from the Henderson place, Delia on the smaller of Caleb's horses, with the documents tied in the oilskin behind her saddle. Caleb had sent a boy to Fenwick's place with a note before they left. The note said only that he'd be gone 4 to 5 days, and asked Roy to check the property twice daily. He didn't explain where he was going. Fenwick would figure it out. The south road was empty in the early morning, snow packed hard enough for good travel. They rode at a pace that was honest without being reckless, and nobody spoke much for the first hour because it was cold, and they were moving, and moving required concentration. At the first road junction, where the trail to Black Hollow split off to the east, Caleb glanced right without stopping. The Black Hollow road was empty. The junction had a weathered post with a sign that had lost most of its paint 2 winters ago, and now read only the first few letters of each word, "O-Hole" and "Cassie," like a message that had given up on being complete. They took the Casper Road. They were 20 miles out when the rider came up behind them, not rushing, just present, appearing in the distance and staying there, maintaining the gap, not gaining and not falling back. Caleb checked 3 times over the first mile, and each time the rider was exactly where he'd been. "We're being followed," he said, without looking back. Clara didn't look back either. "One rider? 1. Harlan's man," Delia said. "She'd checked 2, reporting our position. Most likely." He thought about it. "If we stop, he stops. If we speed up, he speeds up. He's not going to engage us on a public road." "Why not?" Clara said. "Because we're 3 people on a public road in daylight going toward a federal court. Anything he does to stop us is a federal matter." "Then we don't stop," Clara said. "We don't stop," he agreed. They rode through the morning, with the single rider behind them, and Caleb found himself thinking about how different this was from the mountain road, from the 4 riders spread across the trail, from Harlan on his gray horse in the ranch yard. That had been raw power, the kind that doesn't feel it needs to justify itself. This was something else. This was Harlan watching them move toward something he couldn't directly block, and knowing it, and sending one man to observe because observing was all that was left to him. That was not nothing. That was actually something. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses at a creek crossing where the ice had been broken recently by other travelers. Clara got down and went to the water, and Delia did the same, and Caleb stayed on his horse and watched the following rider pull up about 400 yards back and wait. He watched the man. The man was still, had a good horse, wasn't going to do anything. Clara came back to her horse and looked at the distant rider as she remounted. "My father would have found this unbelievable," she said, "that it would come to this, that a piece of land and a river would—" She stopped. "He loved that land because my mother planted a kitchen garden on the south slope, and it was the best soil she'd ever worked. He said she could grow anything there. He said the river made it generous." She said it simply, not asking for anything from it. Just putting it down, the way you set something you've carried too long on a surface that can hold it. Caleb looked at her. "When this is over," he said, "that garden's still on that slope." She looked at him. He said it like a practical observation, which was how he said most things. But she heard what was underneath it, the thing that was neither a promise nor a sentiment, but was both anyway. "I know," she said. They rode on. On the second night, they stayed at a road inn 22 miles north of Casper, a working establishment, public, with 3 other guests, which Caleb had chosen deliberately. The innkeeper was a heavy-set man named Cowboy, who asked no questions because the room rate was fair and asking questions was not in his interest. Caleb paid for 2 rooms. He and Delia took one, Clara the other. The following rider had peeled off somewhere in the afternoon either, satisfied with what he'd seen or instructed to stop at the county line. Caleb didn't know which. He sat on the edge of the bed in his room and looked at the documents he'd been carrying in the interior pocket of his coat, father's journal copy, Pete Purcell's testimony, his own transcription of the original letter. He spread them on the bed and looked at them together. 3 separate families, 3 separate instruments, all pointing to the same hand. He thought about his father, who'd sat across from him at a kitchen table in Indiana when Caleb was 12 years old, and explained what a pattern of evidence was. Not any single fact, his father had said, but the shape made by multiple facts together, the shape that becomes visible only when you step back far enough to see all of them at once. His father had illustrated it with pebbles on the table, moving them until a line appeared. He could see the line now. The question was whether Judge Aldrich would look at it the right way. They reached Casper at midday on the third day. The federal courthouse was a 2-story brick building on the main street, new enough that the brick still had its full color. There was a flag out front and 2 steps up to a heavy door, and the whole thing had the self-conscious permanence of a building that wanted to be taken seriously. Caleb tied the horses, looked at both women. Clara was looking at the building with the expression of someone who has been moving toward a fixed point for so long that arriving at it feels slightly unreal. "Ready?" he said. She smoothed the front of her coat, adjusted the oilskin package under her arm. "I've been ready since I got into your wagon," she said. Delia was already on the steps. They went in. The clerk's office was on the ground floor, left of the entry hall. A young man behind a high desk looked up at them with the automatic wariness of someone who managed public access to important things and had developed opinions about the public. "We need to file a formal complaint," Caleb said, "with documentation, against a Victor Harlan of Black Hollow for fraud, forgery, and coercion. We have 3 affected parties present, and documentation from a 4th. The clerk looked at them, at the oilskin package, at Clara's face, which still carried the last faded traces of the bruise Harlan had put there 3 weeks ago. "I'll need to see Judge Aldrich's calendar," the clerk said, and he said it with a particular tone of someone who'd been told to slow certain things down. "We're not asking for his calendar," Caleb said. "We're asking to file. Filing doesn't require his calendar. It requires your receipt stamp and a case number." The clerk opened his mouth, closed it. From down the hall, a door opened. A man in his 60s, with a straight back and the unhurried movement of someone who had been at his work long enough to recognize the sound of something important through a wall, came out and looked at them. "What's this?" he said. The clerk began to speak. Caleb spoke over him, not loudly, just clearly. "Judge Aldrich, my name is Caleb Mercer. This is Clara Whitmore, and this is Delia Henderson. We have a documented complaint against Victor Harlan of Black Hollow, including evidence of at least 2 forged signatures, a falsified debt instrument with backdated terms, and a recorded statement of predatory intent made by Harlan himself to Miss Whitmore's late father." He paused. "We also have reason to believe that a letter I sent 3 weeks ago to this office was delayed in processing at Harlan's influence." The hall was very quiet. Aldrich looked at them for a long moment. His face was the kind that showed nothing by default and meant it. "Come in," he said. He held the door. They went in. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Aldrich listened the way experienced judges listen, not nodding, not responding, just taking things in with a steadiness that gave nothing away and missed nothing. He asked precise questions when he asked anything, and they were the questions of a man who'd already understood the shape of what was in front of him and was filling in the specific details. He read every document, the ledger, the journal copy, the Purcell testimony, Clara's father's notarized letter. He read them in the order Caleb laid them out, slowly, going back twice to cross-reference specific passages. At the end, he set the last document down and put his hands flat on his desk. "Mr. Harlan," he said, "has a significant number of friends in this territory." "I know that," Caleb said. "He also has a documented enemy in this office," Aldrich said, "which I suspect is part of why you're here." "It's part of it," Clara said. Aldrich looked at her. "Miss Whitmore, the land in question, the river corridor on the Whitmore property. Is it currently occupied or claimed by Harlan? He has a man checking it periodically. He hasn't formally transferred it because I never signed anything." "Because you ran before he could make you," Aldrich said. "Yes. And you've been sheltered on Mr. Mercer's property since." "Yes." Aldrich sat back. "I'm going to be direct with you. What you've brought me today is enough to open a formal federal inquiry. Is not enough. By itself, to close one meaning I can compel documents and testimony, but if Harlan's lawyers contest every piece of this, it will take time." He looked at Caleb. "During which time Mr. Harlan will be aware that the inquiry is open, which will change his behavior." "Change it how?" Delia said. Some men, when they know a federal court is looking at them, become very careful and very still. They wait, they hope it goes away. Aldrich paused. Other men make mistakes. What kind of man is Harlan? Caleb said. Aldrich looked at the documents on his desk. In my experience, he's the second kind. He reached for a form at the side of his desk, dipped his pen. I'm opening the inquiry today, he said. I'll issue a preservation order on the Whitmore land. Harlan cannot transfer or improve it while the inquiry is active. And I'll issue a summons for Harlan to present his original documentation to this court within 30 days. He looked up. In 30 days, this is either resolved or it has become something considerably larger. Clara looked at Caleb. He looked at the judge. 30 days, Caleb said. 30 days, Aldrich confirmed, and he pressed his seal into the wax at the bottom of the form. Yeah, with the deliberate weight of a man who understood what it meant when paper had force behind it. Outside, the afternoon had cleared. The street was busy with the ordinary traffic of a working city wagons, horses, people moving in both directions with specific purposes, and no awareness of what had just happened in the brick building on the corner. They stood on the steps, all three of them. Delia was looking at the street. Clara was looking at the mountains visible to the north, which were the same mountains that stood above Caleb's ranch, and above her family's land, and above Black Hollow. 30 days, Clara said. It's a start, Delia said. Caleb looked at the horses, still tied to the post, then at the road back north, then at the building behind them. 30 days. An inquiry open? A land preservation order filed? A summons with Harlan's name on it, sitting in a federal clerk's records. 3 weeks ago, he'd lifted a piece of canvas and looked at a pair of frightened brown eyes. He'd thought, at the time, that he was making a small decision. He was beginning to understand that there was no such thing. The ride back from Casper took 3.5 days. The same road, the same mountains, the same horses, but everything sitting differently on all three of them, the way weight redistributes after you've set down something heavy. Not lighter exactly, more like rebalanced. Delia rode straighter than she had on the way south. Clara was quieter, but it was a different quality of quiet, not the silence of someone holding themselves together, but the silence of someone who has finally been allowed to think about something other than immediate survival. Caleb noticed both things, and said nothing about either. They parted ways at the junction where the Henderson Ranch Road split off east. Delia pulled her horse up and looked at them both and said she'd write when she heard anything. Then she looked at Caleb specifically with those sharp, dark eyes that didn't waste motion. You're a decent man, she said. Tom would like you if he got over himself enough to admit it. Tell him I said hello, Caleb said. I'll tell him nothing of the sort. He doesn't need to know about any of this yet. She turned her horse. Clara, when the land is yours again, plant something on it. Don't let it sit. Clara watched her go. I won't, she said, though Delia was already 20 yards out and riding hard. They covered the last 12 miles to the ranch without much conversation. The afternoon was going amber and cold, and the snow on the ground had a crust on it from the midday melt and refreeze, and the horses picked their way across it with the careful irritation of animals who had opinions about the footing and weren't being shy about it. When the ranch appeared through the tree line, the same way it had appeared, that first evening, with the upper windows dark and the roof carrying its load of snow, Clara looked at it and then looked at Caleb and said, "It's good to see it." He hadn't expected that to mean something to him. It did anyway. Roy Fenwick had been and gone twice in their absence. As promised, there was fresh feed in the barn, and the water trough had been broken open where it had iced over, and a note on the kitchen table that said only all fine in Roy's cramped handwriting. Caleb stood with the note in his hand for a moment, thought about a man with 3 kids deciding what kind of neighbor he was going to be, filed it away in the category of things worth remembering. The 30 days Aldrich had given were not quiet days. The federal preservation order on the Whitmore land arrived in Black Hollow 11 days after they'd returned from Casper. Caleb heard about it from Silas Holt, who heard about it from a rider passing through who'd seen the order posted in the county clerk's window. Clerk, the same round-shouldered man named Pemberton, who'd never looked anyone in the eye, had been required, by federal mandate, to post it publicly, and apparently he'd done so with the specific misery of a man caught between 2 authorities and liking neither. Harlan's response came in the form of a lawyer from Cheyenne named Aldous Greer. who appeared in Casper 12 days into the 30 and filed a counter motion challenging the legitimacy of Clara's complaint on the grounds that the original debt documentation was valid and properly executed. Caleb read the summary of the motion in a letter from Aldrich's clerk. Aldrich himself had apparently taken a personal interest in keeping them informed, which Caleb noted as significant. Grier's motion cited 3 witnesses who claimed to have seen Franklin Whitmore sign the debt agreement. 3 witnesses. Caleb read that part twice. He brought the letter to Clara. She read it at the kitchen table with her coat still on, having just come in from the barn. 3 witnesses, she said. People Harlan had in his pocket for this moment, Caleb said. He was prepared for someone to challenge the signature. But my father's journal entry. She looked up. He wrote that he suspected the debt from the beginning. If he'd truly signed it voluntarily, he wouldn't have written that. A good lawyer argues he signed it and later convinced himself he hadn't. That sick men misremember. Caleb pulled out the chair across from her. Counter-argument is your father's handwriting. We need the witness in Casper, the man who notarized the letter. Elias Webb. If he's still alive and his memory is sound, his testimony about what your father said when this letter was notarized puts a timeline on your father's state of mind. It shows he was suspicious before the debt was even called due. He paused. A man who signed a debt agreement doesn't immediately go to a notary to document that he has no debts. She was quiet for a moment. We need to find Webb. I already sent word through Holt. He looked at the letter. There's something else. She waited. Aldrich's clerk says 2 other families have made contact with the court in response to Aldrich's inquiry notice. He set the letter down. The Henderson filing brought people out. People who were watching to see if someone would actually go first. Clara looked at the letter. Which families? The clerk didn't name them. Confidential pending formal filing. He sat back. But if 2 more families have come forward independently, that changes the weight of what's in front of Aldrich. He's not looking at one woman's complaint about her father's land anymore. He's looking at a pattern, Clara said. He's looking at a pattern, Caleb agreed. Elias Webb was alive. He was 71, and his print shop had burned in a fire 2 summers ago, and he'd moved to a smaller place on the east edge of Casper, where he did odd jobs for neighbors and kept a vegetable garden under glass. But he was alive, and his memory was, by his own characterization, entirely sound on the things that mattered. Holt brought his response in the 3rd week. Webb had written a long letter in a printer's steady hand, recounting the specific afternoon Franklin Whitmore had come to his shop. He remembered it because Whitmore had been visibly unwell thin, slower than the last time Webb had seen him, and because the content of the letter had been unusual. Webb had asked Franklin why he was having such a document notarized, and Franklin had said, directly, that he was doing it because he believed someone was going to try to take his land after he was gone, and he wanted his daughter to have something with his name on it that couldn't be argued with. Webb had asked who might try to take it. Franklin had said a name. Victor Harlan. Webb had written it down at the time in his shop log, which had survived the fire in a metal box with his business records. He still had it. He was prepared to come to Casper and say all of this in front of a judge, and he was prepared to bring the log. Caleb read the letter twice, then passed it to Clara. She read it once, set it down. Did not cry, which he'd noticed was her pattern. The moments that would make most people cry seemed to produce in her a particular stillness instead, like the feeling went somewhere deep and stayed there. He knew, she said. He knew the whole time. He did everything he could with what he had, Caleb said. It wasn't enough. It was enough for you to have something to fight with. He said it plainly, not as comfort, but as fact. That's what he was trying to do. He couldn't stop Harlan. He was dying and he knew it. So he made sure you weren't going in empty-handed. She looked at the letter for another long moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it with the other documents they'd been keeping in the fireplace recess. When do we need to be in Casper again? She said. Aldrich set the hearing for the 28th day. 12 days from now. She nodded. Then we have 12 days. To do what? She looked at him. To make sure this ranch is in good enough shape that you can leave it for a week without feeling like you're abandoning it. It was such a practical thing, to say that he almost didn't hear what was inside it, the assumption that his concerns mattered, that the ranch mattered, that she was thinking about his situation, alongside her own. He'd been alone long enough that being considered felt slightly foreign, like a word he understood but didn't use often. It's in reasonable shape, he said. The south fence still has 2 posts that are going to go with the spring thaw, she said. And the flue in the main room needs proper cleaning, not just the temporary fix you did in December. He looked at her. You've been making a list. I've been paying attention, she said. There's a difference. They worked the 12 days. It was the most productive stretch the ranch had seen in years. Though Caleb wouldn't have put it that way, because putting it that way would have required acknowledging too many things at once. The south fence posts got reset. The flue got cleaned properly, with the right brush, which he'd finally ordered from Black Hollow through an intermediary rather than going himself. Spring in the tack room that had been squeaking since November got oiled. The loose step on the back porch got a new board. None of it was dramatic. All of it was the kind of work that holds a place together, the maintenance that never feels urgent, and therefore never gets done when there's only one person to do it. With 2 people, the work found its level. Clara took the things she was good at, and Caleb took the things he was good at, and there was surprisingly little overlap and very little negotiation required. On the 9th day, while they were working the fence line together, Clara said, without looking up from the post she was tamping, "What happens after the hearing?" Caleb was setting the next post. Depends on Aldrich's ruling. Assume the ruling goes our way. Then Harlan's debt instrument is voided. Your land is yours. He faces charges on the forgery, probably, though proving it to a criminal standard is harder than the civil case. And the other families? Their cases move forward separately. But the precedent from yours helps them. She was quiet for a moment. The tamping bar came down, solid, into the frozen ground. I mean after that. For you. He stopped, looked at her. She kept working, which he understood was deliberate. She was giving him somewhere to look that wasn't her face, while he worked out what he was going to say. I haven't thought that far, he said, which was partially true. He'd thought far enough to notice there was a question there, but not far enough to answer it. I'll need to go back to my land, she said. Get it running again. There's fencing down, and the house hasn't been lived in for months. She paused. I don't know how to do all of that alone. I've never run a property alone. You could hire help, he said. I could, she said. That's one option. The post went in. She moved to the next position, 12 feet down the line, and began measuring the spacing. He watched her do it the way she'd learned the system from watching him and had made it her own without copying it exactly. He picked up his end of the process and they worked the next 2 posts without talking. The mountains were very clear in the cold afternoon air, the kind of clear that comes only in winter, every ridge visible, the snow on the peaks catching the low sun at an angle that made it look like something lit from inside. I grew up on a property with 2 people working it, he said finally. She waited. My mother and father, neither of them could have done what they did alone. Not because they weren't capable people individually, but because the work is sized for more than one. He said, so, I've been managing a 2-person property alone for 7 years. Everything is always slightly behind where it should be. She looked at him then. He was looking at the fence line. That's not a romantic statement, he said. I want to be clear about that. I know what it is, she said. I'm saying the arrangement makes sense. Practically. It does, she agreed. Your land and this land aren't far. Both properties are being worked by people who know what they're doing. They can support each other. Water sources, grazing rotation, winter feed. Caleb, she said. I know what you're saying, she said. And I know how you're saying it, because you don't know another way to say it yet. She looked at him steadily. I'm not asking you to know another way. I'm just telling you that I heard it. He held her gaze. Something in his chest did what it had been doing, occasionally for the past several weeks the thing he'd been identifying as inconvenient, and then declining to examine further. All right, he said. All right, she said. They finished the fence line. The hearing in Casper lasted 2 days. Elias Webb came and sat in the witness chair, with his metal box of shop records and his 71-year-old's absolute certainty about what he had seen and written, and what Franklin Whitmore had said. And he said it all in a clear, unhurried voice that had none of the tremor of age and all of the weight of a man who had been waiting for someone to ask him. Aldous Greer, Harlan's lawyer from Cheyenne, cross-examined Webb for the better part of an afternoon. Webb was not rattled. He'd spent 40 years in a print business, which meant 40 years of other people's words as passing through his hands. And he had developed, apparently, an immunity to being talked at by men who thought volume was persuasion. Harlan's 3 witnesses testified. They were consistent, which was the problem. They were too consistent, the kind of consistent that happens when people have rehearsed together rather than when people have independently remembered the same true thing. Aldrich asked each of them the same question 3 different ways, and on the 3rd iteration, 2 of them gave identical answers using identical phrasing. Caleb watched Aldrich's face during that exchange. Nothing changed on it, but he wrote something in his notes. Delia Henderson testified about the ledger and the backdated interest. She had brought Tom, this time Tom Henderson, who had come without being asked, who had driven 60 miles in January because his wife had shown him the documents, and because even a careful man, eventually, has to decide if being careful is the same thing as being right. He sat in the gallery and looked at the floor most of the time, and looked up when Delia was speaking, and what was on his face when he looked at her was the complicated mixture of a man who understood he owed his wife something he didn't have clean words for. Marcus Purcell had come from Denver. He was 34, thin, with his father's eyes, and a quality of contained anger that had been traveling a long way, looking for somewhere appropriate to land. He testified about his father's account of the irrigation ditch debt. He was not a polished witness. His voice caught twice, and he lost his place once, and had to be prompted by Aldrich, but he was a true one. And truth has a texture that experience can recognize. The second unknown family turned out to be the Brennans, a couple from the north end of the valley who Caleb had never met, who had sold their water rights under pressure 4 years ago, and had not spoken publicly about it because Mrs. Brennan's brother worked at the county clerk's office, and they'd been afraid for him. They came in together and sat side by side, and the husband did the talking. But the wife kept the testaments, and Aldrich accepted their testimony with the same deliberate attention he gave everything. On the second afternoon, Aldrich reviewed the documentation in chambers for 3 hours. When he came back out, he sat down and folded his hands and looked at Harlan, who had come himself, who had sat in the back of the courtroom for 2 days. With Grier beside him, he let out a short, ugly laugh, who had maintained throughout the entire proceeding the expression of a man who was certain the machinery of the world was still arranged in his favor. "Mr. Harlan," Aldrich said, "in 30 years on this bench, I have learned to distinguish between a contested claim and a fraudulent one. The evidence before me today does not present a reasonable dispute about debt obligations. It presents a systematic pattern of manufactured debt, document falsification, and deliberate coercion applied to multiple families across a period of at least 6 years." He looked at the documents on his desk. The debt instrument purporting to bind the Whitmore land is voided. Ownership reverts fully and immediately to Clara Whitmore. The preservation order becomes permanent pending any criminal proceeding. He looked at Grier. "I'm also referring the question of the document forgeries to the federal prosecutor's office. What they do with that referral is not my decision, but the referral is mine, and I am making it today." Closed his folder. "Mr. Harlan, you're free to leave my courtroom. I expect, however, that this is not the last room you'll be standing in with a federal judge." Harlan left without speaking. He walked out with Grier beside him, and 4 of his men behind him, and he walked the way he'd always walked, straight, deliberate, the posture of a man who expects the world to make room. But something was different, and everyone in the courtroom could see it, the way you can see something's wrong with a load-bearing wall, before it actually fails in the tiny adjustments, the compensations, the effort that wasn't there before. He was 61 years old, and he had built his empire on the silence of people who had nowhere to take their complaints. The silence was over. He was not destroyed, not yet, not completely. A man with that much money and that many lawyers doesn't fall in a single afternoon. But he was diminished, and the diminishment would compound. The other families knew, now that the court was open. Word would move through the valley the way water moves through a thaw, finding every crack. Clara stood on the courthouse steps and watched him go. Caleb stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Is it enough," she said. "To win the hearing, yes. To put him in a cell, maybe, eventually. That's the prosecutor's question." He looked at the street. "To stop him from being what he is? No, he'll adjust. Men like that adjust. But he can't do it here anymore. Not the way he's been doing it. The method is exposed. The county clerk knows a federal judge is watching. The other families have testified on record." He paused. He could try to build something somewhere else. But he's 61 and the method doesn't work when people know to look for it. She seemed to accept that, not with satisfaction, with the honest recognition of what was real. A win that was also a partial thing. A resolution that didn't resolve everything, because most things don't. My father would have, she started, and stopped. Tried again. I think he would have been glad. Not triumphant. Just glad. He was that kind of person. He sounds like a good man, Caleb said. He was, she said. He was also stubborn and occasionally wrong about things and not always easy to talk to. She almost smiled. I'm not pretending he was someone he wasn't just because he's gone. I know, he said. That's a harder thing than it sounds. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains visible above the rooftops to the north, the same mountains they'd ridden through together. Storm and all, the mountains that stood above both their pieces of land. I want to go home, she said. Which one? He said. And the question was careful and genuine, carrying its own weight. She thought about it for a moment, honestly thought about it, not quickly. Both, she said. Eventually. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always did, not as a single arrival, but as a negotiation. Snow and thaw trading ground back and forth across 6 weeks, until the thaw finally won enough of the argument to matter. The river on the Whitmore land ran high and brown with snowmelt in April. Moving fast over the rocks, the way Clara's mother had always described it, the water that made the south slope generous. Clara had moved back to her family's property in March, once the road was passable. Caleb had helped her open. The house cleared the debris from the porch, found where the winter had gotten through a windowsill, and done damage to the floor beneath, repaired what could be repaired immediately, and identified what would need more time. He'd come back 2 weekends in April to work on the fence the winter had taken down. He told himself each time that he was coming to finish a job. True. It was also true that on the third visit, she had made coffee before he arrived, and had the tools laid out, and there had been no point at which his presence required explanation. On a Saturday in early May, he drove his wagon down the south road, the same wagon, the same route, and stopped it at her gate, because she was already outside, standing in the yard, looking at the kitchen garden plot on the south slope. She had her sleeves pushed up and dirt on her hands, and the kind of expression a person has when they're looking at a thing they've planned and are now beginning. He got down from the wagon. You're planting, he said. Trying to. She looked at the plot. The soil's good. My mother always said it was the best she'd worked. He looked at it. The slope caught the morning sun, well, good drainage, southern exposure, the river just close enough to pull moisture through the ground without waterlogging. It was, he had to admit, excellent ground. What are you starting with, he said. Beans, squash, tomatoes when it's warm enough. She looked at him. I don't know what you grow. Potatoes mostly. Some corn. He looked at the slope. I could bring seed potatoes. The variety I have does well in mountain soil. I'd appreciate that. He stood beside her and looked at the garden plot, and she stood beside him and looked at it too, and neither of them was pretending to look at only the garden. There is a thing that happens between people who have been through hard things together. Not the romantic version of it, not the sudden declaration, but something quieter and more durable. A recognition. The understanding that you've seen each other in the specific conditions that reveal what a person is actually made of, and what you've seen is something you can work with, something you can build on. Not because it's perfect. Nothing built by imperfect people is perfect, but because it's real, which is rarer and worth more. Caleb had spent 7 years understanding this ranch as a place to survive. He'd managed it, maintained it, kept it going through the seasons with the competence of a man who knew what he was doing, and the loneliness of a man who was doing it for no one in particular. He'd told himself the loneliness was a choice. He'd told himself he'd made peace with it. He'd been wrong about both, and he was honest enough now to say so, at least to himself. Clara had spent her whole adult life running toward something, a stable life. Her mother's land, some version of the security that kept getting pulled out from under her. She'd spent the last several months running from something, which had felt like the same motion but wasn't. Running from is exhausting in a different way. It empties you out. She was not empty now. She was, cautiously and with full awareness of how things could still go wrong, beginning to feel like a person who was running towards something again. There's a question I've been not asking, he said. She waited. The hearing is done. The land is yours. You don't need. He stopped. Tried again. He was better with wood and rope and honest labor than he was with sentences like this one. You don't need anything from me at this point. Practically. No, she agreed. I don't. I'm asking anyway. She looked at him. He was looking at the garden. I know you are, she said. I'm not going to say it as something it isn't, he said. I'm not going to make it sound Caleb. The way she said it had become, over the months, its own kind of punctuation. Say it the way you know how to say it. That's enough. He looked at her then. The morning light was on her face, and the river was audible from where they stood, and the mountains were behind her, and behind him, and around both of them, indifferent and permanent, and not caring at all about what two people said to each other in a garden on a Saturday in May. Stay, he said. It covered two directions at once, which was the honest version of it. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved through her face, not surprise, more like a door that's slightly open, finally being opened all the way. I was planning to, she said. This is what I've come to believe, watching people navigate the things that try to break them. It isn't the dramatic moments that define who we are. The dramatic moments just reveal it, what's already there. The character that was built across 1,000 ordinary days of deciding how to treat the people around you, whether to look away or turn around, whether to stay quiet or say the thing that needed saying. Caleb Mercer didn't rescue Clara Whitmore because he was a hero. He did it because one morning he was tired of being the man who looked at a shelf when something wrong was happening. That's all. One decision, made at the bottom of a long drift of smaller ones. And it changed everything. Clara Whitmore didn't survive because she was exceptional. She survived because she refused to accept that her father's careful love, a letter in a false-bottomed desk, a signature in front of a witness, had meant nothing. Carried that love in her boot through a blizzard and into a federal courthouse, and she set it on a judge's desk, and she said, "This is real. This happened. You have to look at it." We live in a world where powerful people sometimes construct reality's versions of events, debts that don't exist, agreements no one signed, and count on everyone else's exhaustion and isolation to make those constructions stick. What undoes them isn't always a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's just two families comparing notes. Sometimes it's a print shop ledger in a metal box. Sometimes it's a man who crosses his sevens. The wagon that carried a frightened woman through a frozen mountain pass was not a special wagon. It was just a wagon, the same one he'd driven twice a year for 11 years. But on one particular morning, he lifted the canvas, and that was the whole of it. This story is entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, locations, and events are the product of imagination.